11 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defense special team units I'd look to get on the wire this week. The first one, the Green Bay Packers. So this Packer unit, what a season it's been, man. If this team could just get right on both sides of the ball at the same time, they easily could go and win the Super Bowl this year. So this Packer defense have been lights out this season, and they've scored the last 5 out of 6 fantasy games, double-digit fantasy points. So Week 8 at Arizona, 21 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 intros, a fumble recovery. Week 9 at the Chiefs, it was a down ball game, but they still only gave up 13 points to that offense with a sack. And Week 10 versus Seattle, and Russell Wilson's return, they pitched a shutout, was this Packer defense, 3 sacks and 2 interceptions. So after that game versus Seattle, this defense is for real, and they got to be added in way more fantasy leagues. They're available somehow, which is mind-boggling to me. In 68% of fantasy leagues is this Packer defense. And I know they got a tough matchup Week 11 at the Minnesota Vikings, but I think they could get pressure on Kirk Cousins, obviously. Kirk Cousins has struggled mightily in his career versus this Packer team. And this defense, they're a great unit. They're holding teams down. And it wouldn't surprise me once again to see them do that to Minnesota. So in my opinion, they're one of the top ads out of every position this week on the waiver wire. The next defense I look to get this week's the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks, they look pretty decent in that ball game versus the Green Bay Packers in Week 10. 17 points allowed, only a sack and an interception. So this Seahawk defense, it seems like over the last few years they get off to horrible starts, but as the season goes on, they improve slowly. And it's looked that way the last few weeks. Week 7 versus New Orleans, they had a decent game. 13 points allowed, 2 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 8 versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, 7 points allowed, sack and into, and a return touchdown. And then Week 10, like I mentioned at the Packers, 17 points allowed, a sack and an into. Week 11, I know they got a tough matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, but we don't know if Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins are going to play. I thought they were going to play in Week 10, but that didn't happen, obviously. And their injuries must be really serious if these guys had to sit out 2 weeks in a row. So if they don't play, this Seattle defense, I think, definitely feasts in that ball game. Seahawks, they got to play tough defense, and if they want to contend for the playoffs this year, they got to win the next 3 or 4 in a row just to stay in the hunt here. So right here, the defense has improved a little. The offense has to work the kinks out. But I think if Arizona don't have Murray and Hopkins, they could have a big ball game, obviously, in Week 11, and they're available in 91% of fantasy leagues. The next defense we're staying in the NFC West is the San Francisco 49ers. So the Niners obviously haven't played yet this week here, but they got a great matchup in Week 11 at the Jacksonville Jaguars that give up the 10th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few games before this Monday night game going down tonight, Week 7 versus Indy, 30 points allowed, a sack, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 8 at the Chicago Bears, 22 points allowed, 4 sacks and an into. And Week 9 versus the Arizona Cardinals, 31 points allowed, 2 sacks. So right here, it's pretty much a 1-week ad here is the San Francisco 49er unit. What a great matchup at Jacksonville, like I mentioned. And right now, they're still available in 55% of fantasy leagues. So looking into next week, I think they can make noise and make a few plays on Trevor Lawrence and that offense. The next defense is the Miami Dolphins. So the Dolphins with a shocking victory on Thursday Night Football. Baltimore Ravens, and beating them pretty easily, in my opinion, with a 22-10 victory. So the last few weeks, this defense, they're playing great football. Week 9 versus Houston, 9 points allowed, 5 sacks, 3 intros, and a fumble recovery. In Week 10 versus Baltimore, 10 points allowed only, 4 sacks, an into, a fumble recovery, and a touchdown on it. So right here, it's very hard to hold Lamar Jackson and that offense down, especially to 10 points when they've been putting up 28 to 35 points a game over the last few weeks. And right here, they got a slam dunk matchup Week 11 at the New York Jets. They give up the most fantasy points to defensive units. And we saw Mike White. Everyone thought this guy was the next coming of Joe Namath or something after that huge game versus Cincinnati. But right there, that Buffalo Bill defense made him come down to earth in a big way with 4 interceptions. And right here, I think this Miami defense can make plays on Mike White and this Jet offense. And right here, like I mentioned, they give up the most points to DSTs of the Jets, and they are must-add this week, available in 75% of fantasy leagues. And the fifth and final DST I look to get this week is the Carolina Panthers. So the Panthers, they look good, obviously, versus a few backups over there in Arizona. But hey, they went out there, they got the job done, and they got a blowout victory in Week 10. And their defense played a good part in this ball game. 10 points allowed, 4 sacks, and a fumble recovery for the Panthers. So the Panthers, they've been a middle of the pack defense this season. Week 8 at Atlanta, points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 interceptions. Week 9 versus the Patriots, 18 points allowed, 2 sacks, an into, and a fumble recovery. And Week 10, like I mentioned, at the Cardinals, 10 points allowed, 4 sacks, and an into with a fumble recovery. So right here, Week 11, pretty decent matchup versus the Washington football team. That gives up the 11th most amount of fantasy points to DST. So right here, the Panthers, like I mentioned, they got Stephon Gilmore, shutdown corner, and they got a few decent pass rushes and a couple playmakers as well. So right here, I think this defense can have a decent matchup and a decent game versus Heineke in Week 11. And right now, they're available widely in 71% of fantasy leagues. That's a few defensive and special team units I'd look to get on the waiver wire for Week 11 of the fantasy football season.